So Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones had very few alterations imposed on by George Lucas from format to format, but it's a very interesting IMAX run. They had the most changes done to it due to the 2-hour maximum runtime, forcing 20 minutes to be cut out of the film. I figured we'd take a good long look at the IMAX version of the second chapter, the Star Wars prequel trilogy. So May 16, 2002 saw the release of the middle chapter of the Star Wars prequel trilogy, which actually garnered the least amount of money of the three films at the box office, with Phantom Menace grossing over $1 billion, this one about $653 million, and Revenge of the Sith grossing over $860 million. So all of them were still very successful, very profitable films, but you could kind of see a dip down in interest to a certain degree about repeat viewings and going back to the theater over and over again. And this was a very interesting release to a certain degree because it had the 35mm regular print release, but also very limited digital screenings at the time, which was like almost near non-existent at the time. It's like barely able to do that. I got to see a digital screening for Episode 3, but not Episode 2. And then Episode 2 is the one of the three that I have like no memories of the release. Nothing, no fervor. There was fervor, stuff like that, but for me personally, there was no memorable theater experience for it. The first one, there was so jazzed up and stuff like that, and I had a lot of interesting memories for it. The third one, for multiple screenings I saw for it, but Attack of the Clones is kind of this big bling spot for me in terms of that point in time, what was happening, and how I felt about it at the time, stuff here and there. But as you go on the entire thing, it's okay, Phantom Menace had a certain amount of criticisms, and they thought, well, moving on and going into the next one, they did kind of address some things, kind of minimize certain elements, but there's certain other things like stiff wooden dialogue, the very lackluster Padme Amidala, Anakin Skywalker romance that just didn't feel organic or natural. The dialogue is very much not very good, and the chemistry is not really there. A lot of stuff, there's very much a over-reliance on action sequences. They really kind of pad out the runtime, or they kind of run a little bit over long, in my opinion, and various other things. A lot of things you can really get into the nitty-gritty, but of course, there are still fans of these films, and there are very much people who very much revere them, very much enjoy them, don't have that many problems with them. There was an IMAX release on November 1st, 2002. Now, the very interesting thing is the fact that, like I said in the intro here, at the time, even though there's still all the stuff still on film, because of the limitations of the spindles, the projectors, anything like that, just what they had set up for that type of format, they couldn't do more than 2 hours of film on the entire projector there. So to get anything into that format, they had to cut the film down in very interesting ways to kind of get it to squeeze down that regard. And it took about 14 weeks of imagery mastering because, as the film was shot and presented in CinemaScope, and so they had to do a lot of panning and scanning, reformat the image to get it up on that regard, and just have things go off in different ways to make sure they also up-resed it, upscaled the image to make sure it fit everything properly, and then printed out to all those big reels of film. And of course, there was very few, even much fewer IMAX screens at that point in time, and this was very much the real deal IMAX stuff, not the stuff you go to the AMCs or something else like that. This was the real, full, immersive, peripheral vision type of stuff. You were seeing in that regard. So a lot of these action sequences are not shot with that in mind, and of course, cropping down the frame and having things a little bit zoomed in certainly made more of an experience in that regard. And it's very much thanks to a report from theforce.net that we have sort of details about exactly what was observed to have been cut for the entire thing. Now, it's not pinpoint accurate about exactly every single shot or every single different transition or anything like that. So, interesting different things, because the first thing that gets cut for the IMAX version on the entire thing is pretty much the second scene in the entire film, when you have, after the explosion on the sort of landing pad there with Padme Amidala, we're going to Chancellor Palpatine's office. You got Padme Amidala, you got Bail Organa, Yoda, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, all these different people discussing the situation about the attempted assassination, talking about Count Dooku, Separatists, all that type of stuff, that Count Dooku was once a Jedi, and he wouldn't be capable of these anything. So it's kind of laying out the elements in the story here for things to be picked up later on, but removing the scene makes it that, one, Dooku and the Separatists don't get mentioned again until Dooku actually appears in the film for the first time, 62 minutes into it. And also, it removes Bail Organa's introduction to the entire film, where he doesn't show up to it much further later in the film than that, when they're actually talking about the creation of this clone army and where it came from, and all the different things about what Dooku's thing to do with the Separatists and the droid army, stuff like that. So that's almost like 40 minutes before the film's over. So it's a very interesting type of thing, like very key type of scene to remove at the beginning of the entire thing. It is a fairly long scene in that regard to kind of do a little work to kind of chop something out of there, but it does kind of remove certain character introductions and certain plot elements that would be picked up later on. So in one way, it does make it more of a blanket mystery that no one has any conjecture whatsoever about who's behind anything. It's just, okay, Obi-Wan, and it can kind of weave through a mystery and kind of follow the clues here and there, and no one really has any clue whatsoever where anything is. And there's no really, again, no discussion about the political landscape. The whole thing is just a little bit more vague in that regard, despite you have information in the opening crawl. None of it's discussed, none of it's pushed forward, nothing's really put into motion in that regard to have the characters kind of talk about it or combat with the entire thing. So it's almost like it gets introduced in the opening crawl now, and now halfway into the film, now we get it picked up again. So it's just interesting to kind of remove that kind of slightly long scene that has a lot of fertile information in it, but they kind of felt like maybe we could kind of get away with not having that there. So there's that, and of course, Palpatine, his introduction gets pushed much further on in the film, but not nearly as late as these other elements. But also, now things get a little bit chopped up from going from the landing platform right into the elevator scene between Obi-Wan and Anakin, and they kind of chop out a little bit of things where they get out of the elevator, talk to Jar Jar, Jar Jar introduces them to Amidala and stuff like that here and there. So it's just a little kind of shoe leather kind of pulled out of the entire thing, which works just fine. It still cuts together fairly nicely. But then we move into the second assassination attempt on Amidala there, where we have the entire thing with the eels going into the entire bedroom there. And we cut a little bit of a line here from Dorme, who goes into the entire scene to check on Padme, and her line's cut out of that thing. And then after Obi-Wan jumps out and grabs the entire assassin droid, just a few minor bits where the thing's kind of brushing up against the entire buildings and whatnot. That's cut out entirely. So a few minor little snips here and there. Just probably went through and kind of did the big chunks first, and kind of went back and kind of examined a few minor little seconds here and there that could kind of clip out that would be fairly innocuous to most people. Now the next major scene cut on the entire thing is the fact you have the scene between Mace Windu, Yoda, and Obi-Wan kind of walking through the Jedi table having some discussions. And one of them, of course, is about sensing some arrogance in young Anakin, and how that's being much more of a prevalent failing about young Jedis right now, kind of commenting it here and there. So it's a nice little scene, but I could see them kind of pulling that out as not being hardcore essential for the story to flow. Next up is just a little bit of a truncation of a scene, because you have the entire thing where you have Anakin and Padme, they're going to be going off-world, so they could be a little bit more in isolation and protect her. And just the entire beginning of that scene where they're on the transport here, they cut out the exchange between Padme and Dorme there, and they just go right into the entire discussion between Anakin and Obi-Wan there, and they kind of move off from the scene from there. And after that, they actually remove the scene where Obi-Wan goes to the Jedi archives to research Kamino and finds it's not there anymore. So it just goes from Obi-Wan going to Dex, then going to Yoda and the younglings. So just some removing a step here and there, but the main thing that gets the most stuff chopped out of it are the Naboo sequences. Now the arrival of Anakin and Padme on Naboo is a little bit kind of chopped in half. They go over there, the entire bridge thing, but right after that, it cuts out. So none of that sort of thing where they're walking around the big curved sort of hallway or whatnot, the corridor there, that's gone. Meeting with Queen Jamila is gone. The entire picnic scene is gone. So there's a lot of things and a lot of little things as well. It's like when they go into the sort of island resort and she's got the kind of open back dress and he's saying stuff about, oh, here is all things nice and smooth, and he's caressing her back. All that's cut out. That little bit is cut out of there. So it kind of goes from talking about sand being coarse and rough and hated and gets everywhere, over to them just having this kind of alluring stare down type of thing going on there, and they kind of pull away from the kiss. And just little things here and there just get chopped out even after they have the dinner scene. And they're kind of like sitting down and talking with each other over the fireplace type of thing. Still a couple of lines of dialogue that are kind of chopped out of the whole thing. That kind of makes it a little less cringy. Stuff like he's talking about,
I'm haunted by the kiss that you should never have given me.
Reportedly, that little line got chopped out and a few other things kind of finessed to make it a little bit better in that regard. So some places it kind of makes the scenes a little bit more to the point. It makes it a little bit more finesse. A lot of stuff's cut out, and also the fact that when you go back to Anakin where he's having the nightmare, that's also not there. It only goes to him standing on the balcony watching the sunrise. there's a little bit of truncation on the Kamino end of things here, where after Obi-Wan's done the entire tour of the entire cloning facility, he's going off on the entire landing platform there. Well, it cuts off just a little bit of things where it goes off to R4 and starts the transmission. It cuts directly from the landing platform exit out to Mace Windu and Yoda receiving the holocron transmission. So a little bit there, and also cuts out the end of the sequence there, where Mace Windu is talking about,
I think it is time we inform the Senate that our ability to use the Force is diminished.
and Yoda's kind of arguing against that about all these different replication, that thing, that's gone completely. So, little interesting little plot points in a certain way. They're there to kind of lay a seed for something that really, that sort of stuff doesn't come up to like Revenge of the Sith, where they can have any sort of further addressment of that. And the last thing removed from the Kamino sequence is in the fight between Jango Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they actually turn the Slave One cannons on Kenobi. That part of it is removed. But on the Tatooine side of things, it's just a little bit of trims here and there. But they're kind of interesting, because when we get to the Lars homestead, it kind of a little thing where 3PO introduces Anakin and Padme to Owen and Beru Lars. So you just don't really have an introduction for who the characters are. You just cut into the entire thing where Klieg Lars is discussing the entire situation of what happened to Shmi Skywalker. So there's that, and also, most of the stuff happens during this sort of confession scene. But the beginning part of it where Anakin's talking about the world seems so much easier when you're fixing things, that's out. It just starts pretty much right into the start of the rant, and the confession, and the rage, and stuff like that. But interestingly enough, there's a very interesting sort of addition to the home video version of the entire thing, and apparently in the digital release version in theaters, a little bit of scene extension there, because the entire thing where Padme says at the end of the thing is like,
to be angry is to be human.
I'm a Jedi. I know I'm better than this.
this version maintains the original 35mm theatrical release, where it cuts off when Anakin drops down in his grief and his rage and all that sadness and stuff like that, and it pretty much just kind of cuts there into the entire funeral scene. And the next thing is until Geonosis here, where you have Obi-Wan kind of held captive, and they just chopped out a little bit of footage of Dooku kind of walking through the corridors and the caverns and whatnot, walking into the chamber there, and they cut out his last line in the scene there, where Dooku says,
"It may be difficult to secure your release."
And an interesting truncation here is in the scene where they go back into Palpatine's office. Everyone's talking there about whether or not to sanction the clone army, stuff like that here and there, and even though they just got off the holocron with Amidala, it's like, okay, she needs to be here. We can't have her on the holocron to make a decision. So they have the entire thing where, again, a criticism to throw at Jar Jar. He's the one who gets everything in thrown off in the wrong directions here through Palpatine's fairly transparent sort of manipulations to the audience. Thinking like, oh, if Senator Amidala was here, she would know what to do. She would be able to do these things and sanction this and make a motion for that. That's cut out of the IMAX version. They just have kind of Bail Organa and all the other scenes kind of back and forth, and they cut out before any of that is even spoken. That entire section of the scene is gone, but of course you still go into the Senate later on, and Jar Jar's making the motion to sanction the clone army and the emergency powers, all that type of stuff here and there. So they cut out the part of the scene that kind of flowed to the next one. So anything like that, they just felt like whatever got to cut it out. It kind of makes sense in the later scene, so you can just jump to the conclusion of certain things here and there. So then once Anakin and Padme get to Geonosis, there's like just a couple of like lines from C-3PO that are cut out when like him and R2 bantering to a certain degree. It's just a few minor like seconds shaved off here and there. But as you're kind of going forward into like a lot of action sequences, barely touched. It's like a couple of things shaved off in the droid factory sequence, and kind of that one point is when Padme drops it down to that big sort of canister, and they had a little bit of a teaser, sort of bit of suspense there when they were showing like the iris kind of pouring the molten steel into each one of the canisters, and they kind of do a trick of editing, kind of make you fake out thinking that it's going to drop into Padme's one, but it's not. That bit is cut out for the IMAX version. But moving on from that, it's like you get past all this stuff, like all the action sequences, the droid clone trooper battle, the Dooku lightsaber stuff, all the stuff in that regard. There's nothing else cut pretty much until nothing altered, nothing kind of different to a certain degree, until pretty much just about the end of the whole thing, when you get the marriage of Anakin and Padme there. And the particular thing is that in the 35mm theatrical prints, there's a certain shot with his mechanical hand that he could not get done in time in order to get all the prints done for the theatrical run, but obviously in the digital projection and of course into the IMAX run, they had the final version that's on the DVDs and Blu-rays. Because originally, when they were having the whole thing where she takes his mechanical hand in her hand, it was pretty much like just kind of a static shot. It was just a shot of her already holding his hand, and then they cut into a close-up of their faces. Well, in the final version, obviously, they finished the digital effect of the hand moving up into her hand, and then panning the shot up into their faces and stuff like that. So, just a minor change in that regard from what you might have seen theatrically in a 35mm screening towards this version. But beyond that, the only other thing they did particularly to kind of shave off time is that the end credits are going to run long. And as it was in my version that I kind of cut together to watch it for this version, they do run long as they would be untouched. So they actually went ahead and made them just title cards. Instead of having a scrolling crawl, they just had the credits come up in the screen for a couple seconds, fade in, fade out, and fill up the screen with as many credits as they could. So it just makes a bit of a real much more abbreviated runtime for those credits. They get it crammed in and shave off a couple of minutes in that regard. So that's basically it for the IMAX version. Now the DVD version has a few minor tweaks here, such as when you have the entire sort of pod chase or whatnot in the skies of Coruscant, they kind of switch around the sequence of shots when they're going through the power couplings. Just a different choice that George made from the theatrical version into like the DVD and Blu-ray versions from there. And also, after the Dooku lightsaber battle, he also changed a number of sequences of shots here between Dooku escaping, flying off in his little shuttle there, and everything kind of aftermath with Yoda and Anakin and Obi-Wan just kind of on the floor of the entire hangar bay there. Now, my assessment of this version of the film kind of cut down and kind of have certain chunks of expository dialogue, a little bit of character development kind of pulled out, and various other little plot points not quite introduced at the same points in time. It's an interesting type of thing. It makes it much more of a kind of a narrow focus type of thing, because again, you don't have introductions for Bail Organa and various other elements of the entire story right up in the front of the whole thing, so it kind of just takes on a bit more of a focused narrative that doesn't have quite as much, not so much like a substance to it, but just doesn't feel quite as expansive on what it's trying to do to flesh out the story overall. So as you go through that first hour, and there's no talk about Separatists or Dooku or anything like that, it's just this sort of assassination plot mystery and a little bit of the romance stuff in that regard. It's okay. It's a nice kind of lean version of the entire story here that cuts out some scenes I don't quite enjoy as much when they're trying to force a sort of romance plot forward. And so it works to a certain degree. I wouldn't call it like a particularly great cut. Like George, obviously, this was never like commercially released on any sort of home video format. It's not a version that George's saying, yeah, I kind of endorse this as like maybe an alternate version of the film, a special edition or something like that. No, it was just saying conform to a different theatrical format to make sure they could exploit that and kind of test the waters for what they would probably want to do maybe much later on with the format and see what else it can do for IMAX, as it just became such a prevalent format when you get up to like Dark Knight and they're actually shooting sequences in 2007 for the 2008 release in IMAX film format. It's like it got up so fast. They really wanted to use this format with the high resolution stuff and make it a cinematic event in that regard. So you got stuff like that, the Marvel films, Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, all these getting exclusive IMAX releases. It became such a major, real small stepping stone towards making that happen for big blockbuster films. As this thing was kind of like really kind of mangled to a certain degree. You gotta crop down the format, you gotta re-edit the thing to chop it a whole bunch out to kind of get it into that thing, but it really was that first kind of thing to test the waters. How would it work out? Can we start using this? Can we start making films that fit for IMAX format? Very much a particular piece of cinema history that should not go overlooked and not be discounted, because it really was just something that showed like there is a market for this and there's something we can actually start building on from this point forward to really make a special use of that high resolution immersive film experience. So guys, let me know what you thought about this entire thing, this exploration of the Attack of the Clones IMAX version, and just thanks for checking things out around here. Subscribing, liking, commenting, all this stuff does a great deal of help around here. Sharing the links around tremendously helps. Of course, there's always the Patreon to contribute something every month to get early access for everything. And the Super Things feature on YouTube. You contribute things directly through the channel. Don't have to leave the format, and it goes directly through me. So guys, thanks so much. Take care.